When we talk about the greatest American generals of World War II, the discussion usually centers on famous names and larger-than-life personalities. But reputation doesn't win wars, results do. In this video, we're ranking the 5 best American generals of WW2 by one standard only: what they actually accomplished, battles won, objectives achieved, and real impact on the course of the war. Their stories are filled with brilliant decisions and terrible mistakes, personal rivalries and loyal friendships, controversy and triumph. These men were notorious for different reasons, but they all delivered results when America needed them most. But before we start, hit that like button and subscribe if you want YouTube to recommend you more content like this. And share any stories you or your relatives have from World War II down in the comments. All right, let's start with number 5, George Marshall, the architect of victory. George Marshall never fired a shot in anger during World War II. Yet without him, America might have lost the war before it even began. When Marshall became Chief of Staff of the United States Army in 1939, he inherited a military force that ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's army. The entire United States Army had fewer than 200,000 men, using outdated equipment and training methods from the First World War. Marshall looked at this pathetic force and knew he had less than 2 years to build a war machine capable of fighting simultaneously in Europe and the Pacific. What made Marshall notorious wasn't his battlefield tactics, but his absolutely ruthless approach to transforming the American military. He fired hundreds of senior officers who couldn't adapt to modern warfare, many of them his friends and colleagues from decades of service. Marshall didn't care about hurt feelings or tradition. If an officer was too old, too slow, or too stuck in outdated thinking, Marshall removed them without hesitation. He promoted young, aggressive officers over the heads of their superiors, causing massive controversy throughout the military establishment. Marshall's most notorious decision was selecting Dwight Eisenhower, a lieutenant colonel who had never commanded troops in combat, and elevating him to eventually become Supreme Commander of all Allied forces in Europe. People thought Marshall was insane, but he saw something in Eisenhower that others missed. Marshall's organizational genius became legendary throughout the war. He personally oversaw the expansion of the Army from 200,000 to over 8 million soldiers in less than 4 years. He created training programs that could transform factory workers and farm boys into effective combat soldiers in months rather than years. Marshall established new military doctrines, rebuilt the command structure, and coordinated production of weapons and equipment on a scale never seen before in human history. He worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, managing every aspect of America's military expansion. Marshall's relationship with President Roosevelt was complicated and often contentious. Roosevelt wanted Marshall to serve as Supreme Commander for the D-Day invasion, recognizing his brilliance and wanting him to have the glory of leading the liberation of Europe. Marshall refused, insisting he was more valuable in Washington, managing the global war effort. This decision showed Marshall's notorious sense of duty over personal ambition. He knew that coordinating armies across 2 oceans, managing production, training, and supply lines required someone in Washington, not on the front lines. Roosevelt eventually agreed, though he was disappointed that Marshall would never get the battlefield glory he deserved. Marshall's most ruthless quality was his absolute intolerance for failure or incompetence. When generals in the field made mistakes, Marshall removed them immediately, regardless of their political connections or previous achievements. He famously clashed with Douglas MacArthur, who wanted more resources for the Pacific Theater, while Marshall insisted on a Europe-first strategy. Marshall won that bureaucratic war through sheer force of will and superior strategic thinking. He understood that defeating Nazi Germany had to be the priority. Even though the American public was more interested in avenging Pearl Harbor, Marshall's strategic vision shaped the entire American war effort. He pushed for the cross-channel invasion of France when British leaders wanted to continue fighting around the periphery of Europe. He understood that only a direct assault on Germany through France could end the war quickly. Churchill and the British generals fought Marshall on this strategy for 2 years, but Marshall never backed down. He threatened to shift American resources to the Pacific if the British wouldn't commit to invading France. This was an audacious bluff that worked, forcing the British to agree to Operation Overlord. The stories about Marshall's notorious management style became legendary in military circles. He would sit in meetings with dozens of generals and admirals, listening to their proposals and plans. When someone presented a bad idea, Marshall would tear it apart in seconds with cold, logical precision that left the presenter humiliated. Officers learned to come to Marshall's meetings over-prepared because he would find any flaw in their thinking. Yet, Marshall also had a reputation for fairness and loyalty to competent officers. If someone worked hard and delivered results, Marshall protected them from political interference and made sure they received recognition. Marshall's notorious eye for talent extended beyond Eisenhower. He promoted George Patton, Omar Bradley, Mark Clark, and dozens of other officers who would become famous battlefield commanders. Marshall studied every officer's record personally, keeping detailed notes on thousands of officers and their capabilities. When positions opened up, Marshall knew exactly who should fill them. This personal attention to personnel management meant that America fielded the best possible commanders at every level of the military. Marshall's relationship with Congress was another area where his ruthless efficiency showed through. He testified before congressional committees hundreds of times during the war, always prepared with exact facts and figures. When politicians tried to micromanage military decisions or push for pet projects that would waste resources, Marshall shut them down with devastating effectiveness. He had no patience for political games when American lives were at stake. Senators and representatives learned that trying to manipulate Marshall was pointless, so most of them simply gave him what he asked for. The scale of Marshall's achievement becomes clear when you consider the numbers. He built an army that grew from 200,000 to 8 million soldiers. He oversaw the production of millions of rifles, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and countless tons of ammunition and supplies. He coordinated the training of these millions of men, the construction of hundreds of military bases, and the development of new guns and tactics. Marshall managed the deployment of American forces to Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, China, and dozens of other locations around the world. He did all this while maintaining civilian control of the military and working within America's democratic system. After the war, Marshall's notorious competence led President Truman to send him to China to try to negotiate peace between the nationalists and communists. Marshall spent a year in China trying to prevent a civil war, but even his skills couldn't overcome the deep hatred between the two Chinese factions. Marshall returned to America frustrated by his failure, one of the few times in his career that he couldn't accomplish his mission. Marshall's greatest post-war achievement was the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe and prevented the continent from falling into chaos and potentially communism. Marshall understood that winning the peace was just as important as winning the war. He convinced Congress to spend billions of dollars rebuilding former enemies, a controversial position that many Americans opposed. Marshall argued that a stable, prosperous Europe was essential for American security, and history proved him right. The Marshall Plan became one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives in American history, creating the foundation for decades of peace and prosperity in Western Europe. Marshall's legacy as the architect of American victory in World War II remains secure. Without his organizational genius, ruthless personnel management, and strategic vision, the United States could not have mobilized its vast resources effectively enough to win the war. He never received the public glory that battlefield commanders enjoyed, but every American victory in the war traced back to decisions Marshall made in Washington. His notorious efficiency, cold logic, and absolute dedication to duty made him indispensable to Allied victory. Now at number 4, we have Douglas MacArthur, the Pacific Supreme Commander. Douglas MacArthur was already a legendary figure before World War II began, and he would become one of the most controversial and notorious generals in American history during the conflict. MacArthur had won the Medal of Honor in World War I, served as Superintendent of West Point, and commanded American forces in the Philippines before the war started. He had a massive ego, a flair for dramatic statements, and an unshakable belief in his own genius. MacArthur also had the strategic mind and ruthless determination to back up his arrogance with results. When the Japanese attacked the Philippines in December 1941, MacArthur's forces were caught unprepared despite having hours of warning after the Pearl Harbor attack. His air force was destroyed on the ground, and Japanese troops quickly overran most of the islands. MacArthur retreated to the Bataan Peninsula with his remaining forces, conducting a desperate defense for months. While waiting for reinforcements that would never come, President Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate to Australia, leaving his men behind to surrender to the Japanese. MacArthur hated abandoning his troops, and as he left the Philippines by PT boat, he made his famous declaration, "I shall return." Most military leaders thought this was empty propaganda, but MacArthur meant every word. MacArthur's notorious personality made him difficult to work with, but impossible to ignore. He referred to himself in the third person, staged photographs to make himself look heroic, and issued grandiose press releases about his accomplishments. He kept a personal public relations staff to manage his image and regularly clashed with Washington when he didn't get the resources he demanded. MacArthur believed the Pacific Theater should be the priority for American forces, while Marshall and Roosevelt insisted on defeating Germany first. This fundamental disagreement created tension throughout the war, with MacArthur constantly fighting for more troops, ships, and supplies. Despite these bureaucratic battles, MacArthur developed one of the most brilliant strategic concepts of the entire war: island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island in the Pacific, MacArthur proposed bypassing the strongest fortifications and capturing islands that would cut Japanese supply lines and provide bases for advancing toward Japan. This strategy saved countless American lives and accelerated the pace of the Pacific Campaign. Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands would slowly starve without supplies, becoming irrelevant to the war effort. While American forces leapfrogged past them toward the Japanese home islands, MacArthur's first major test of this strategy came in New Guinea, where Japanese forces controlled the northern coast and threatened Australia. MacArthur conducted a series of amphibious landings along the coast. Bypassing Japanese strongpoints and cutting off their supply lines, the Japanese expected frontal assaults on their prepared positions. But MacArthur's forces would land behind them, forcing the Japanese to abandon their fortifications or be surrounded. This campaign took 2 years of brutal jungle fighting. But MacArthur consistently outmaneuvered the Japanese commanders and drove them back toward the Philippines. The stories of MacArthur's personal bravery became legendary during the New Guinea campaign. He would often go ashore with the assault troops, walking beaches under enemy fire to inspect positions and boost morale. MacArthur seemed utterly fearless under fire, never taking cover while bullets snapped past him. Some officers thought this was reckless showboating, but the common soldiers loved seeing their commander sharing their dangers. MacArthur understood the power of personal example and used it ruthlessly to inspire his troops. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 prevented MacArthur from leading the invasion of Japan that he had been planning for months. MacArthur had mixed feelings about the atomic bombs, recognizing that they saved hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese lives that would have been lost in an invasion, but also feeling robbed of the climactic battle that would have crowned his Pacific campaign. When Japan surrendered, MacArthur was chosen to accept the surrender and lead the occupation, roles that suited his talents perfectly. MacArthur's acceptance of the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri became another carefully staged moment of theater. He delivered a speech about peace and reconciliation, while Japanese officials stood in humiliation before him, signing documents that ended their empire. MacArthur then became the de facto ruler of Japan, wielding more power than the emperor himself. His occupation policies transformed Japanese society, introducing democratic reforms, women's rights, land redistribution, and a new constitution that renounced war. MacArthur's success in Japan became his greatest achievement, proving that his strategic vision extended beyond winning battles to building lasting peace. Now, at number 3, we have Omar Bradley, the soldier's general. Omar Bradley was the opposite of MacArthur in almost every way, yet he became one of the most effective American generals of World War II through quiet competence and careful planning, rather than dramatic gestures and self-promotion. Bradley commanded more American troops than any other general during the war, leading the 12th Army Group through Northwest Europe with over 1 million men under his command. His nickname, the soldier's general, reflected his reputation for caring about the welfare of his troops and minimizing casualties whenever possible. Bradley's notorious attention to detail and methodical planning style produced consistent victories without the flashy breakthroughs that made headlines. But his steady approach ground down German resistance and liberated Western Europe. Bradley's rise to high command came through the patronage of his West Point classmate, Dwight Eisenhower, who recognized Bradley's talents and promoted him rapidly through course and Army command. Before World War II, Bradley had never commanded troops in combat, and had spent most of his career in training and staff positions. When Eisenhower gave Bradley command of I-2 Corps in North Africa after the disaster at Kasserine Pass, many officers doubted that this quiet staff officer could restore American fighting spirit. Bradley proved the doubters wrong by implementing tough training standards, improving coordination between infantry and armor, and personally visiting frontline units to assess their readiness. Bradley's notorious realism about American combat effectiveness set him apart from more optimistic generals. He understood that American troops needed time to develop the combat skills that German soldiers had learned through years of fighting. Bradley refused to order attacks that would waste lives without achieving significant objectives. Even when this caution frustrated his superiors, who wanted faster results during the Tunisia campaign, Bradley carefully rebuilt Sucre into an effective fighting force, learning from German tactics and improving American coordination and combined arms operations. When Sucre finally went back on the attack, they fought effectively and captured their objectives with acceptable casualties. Bradley's success in North Africa convinced Eisenhower to give him command of First Army for the D-Day invasion. Bradley spent months planning every detail of the American landings at Omaha and Utah beaches, coordinating with Navy and Air Force commanders to provide maximum support for the assault troops. The planning for Omaha Beach became controversial because Bradley knew the beach. Defenses were formidable, But intelligence failures prevented the Americans from realizing just how strong the German fortifications had become. When the landings began, Omaha Beach turned into a nightmare of death and chaos that nearly failed. The stories of D-Day focus on the bravery of the infantry who stormed Omaha Beach, but Bradley's role in salvaging the landing is often overlooked. As reports came back about the disaster unfolding on Omaha, some commanders suggested abandoning the beach and diverting follow-up waves to Utah Beach or the British sectors. Bradley refused to consider retreat, insisting that the troops on Omaha had to be reinforced and supported no matter what the cost. Bradley personally coordinated naval gunfire support, sending destroyers directly onto the beach to blast German positions at point-blank range. He ordered combat engineers to blast gaps through the beach obstacles under fire, and he pushed reserve units onto Omaha despite the horrible casualties. Bradley's determination to hold Omaha Beach, combined with the extraordinary courage of the troops on the ground, eventually secured the beachhead. After D-Day, Bradley faced the frustrating challenge of breaking out of Normandy through the dense hedgerow country of northern France. The blockage terrain gave every advantage to German defenders who could hide in the thick hedge and ambush American units advancing through narrow lanes. Bradley's armies made slow, grinding progress, measured in fields and villages rather than miles, taking heavy casualties for minimal gains. Critics argued that Bradley was too cautious and should have concentrated his forces for massive breakthrough attacks. Bradley insisted that the bookage made such attacks impossible and that methodical pressure across the entire front would eventually crack the German defenses. Bradley's notorious modesty prevented him from taking credit for victories and made him almost invisible to the American public compared to flashier generals like Patton and MacArthur. Bradley held few press conferences and gave generic statements that made poor newspaper copy. He refused to stage dramatic moments or cultivate reporters, believing that results should speak for themselves. This attitude earned respect from other professional officers, but meant that Bradley never received the public recognition his achievements deserved. After the war, Bradley became Army Chief of Staff, and later the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, serving in that position during the Korean War. Bradley's notorious caution influenced his advice during the Korean War, where he argued against MacArthur's proposals to expand the war into China. Bradley famously testified that attacking China would be the wrong war at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. This statement captured Bradley's strategic wisdom and his understanding that military force had to serve political objectives, not simply pursue military victories regardless of consequences. Bradley's World War II legacy rests on his consistent effectiveness rather than spectacular individual battles. He commanded more American troops than any other general and led them from Normandy to the heart of Germany with steady competence. His methodical style saved American lives while grinding down German resistance and achieving strategic objectives. Professional historians rank Bradley among the finest American generals for his balanced approach that combined careful planning with aggressive execution when opportunities arose. All right, at number 2 is George Patton, the master of mobile warfare. George Patton was the most aggressive, controversial, and effective tactical commander America produced in World War II, a general whose personality was as explosive as his battlefield success. Patton believed in speed, violence, and relentless offensive action, doctrines that made him legendary among his troops and feared by his enemies. His notorious temper, vulgar language, and absolute self-confidence made him difficult for superiors to control. But nobody could deny that Patton got results. When Patton's Third Army became operational in France after the Normandy breakout, it drove hundreds of miles in weeks, liberating territory faster than any army in history and destroying German forces too slow to escape. Patton's philosophy of warfare was simple: attack, keep attacking, and when the enemy starts to break, attack even harder. He had no patience for careful preparation or methodical advances, believing that speed and aggression would save more lives than caution ever could. Patton told his officers that the way to prevent American casualties was to make the enemy die for his country, and Third Army followed this doctrine ruthlessly. Patton's notorious reputation preceded his arrival in England to prepare for D-Day. He had commanded American forces in North Africa and Sicily, where his aggressive tactics and battlefield success were overshadowed by two incidents where he slapped shell-shocked soldiers he believed were cowards. Eisenhower nearly sent Patton home in disgrace, but the German army feared Patton more than any other American general, so Eisenhower kept him in Europe. The Germans believed Patton would command the D-Day invasion and concentrated their forces opposite the Phantom Army Group Patton, supposedly led in southeast England. This deception operation helped the D-Day landing succeed because German reinforcements were held back waiting for Patton's non-existent invasion. After D-Day, Patton took command of Third Army and waited impatiently for the breakout from Normandy. When Operation Cobra smashed through German lines in late July 1944, Patton unleashed Third Army in a rampage across France that stunned everyone, including his own superiors. Third Army drove into Brittany, wheeled east toward Paris, and then turned south and east again, covering hundreds of miles in weeks while destroying or capturing tens of thousands of German soldiers. Patton's tanks moved so fast that they outran their supply lines. But Patton kept pushing forward, arguing that a moving army was harder to stop than one waiting for supplies to catch up. The stories about Patton's personal leadership style became legendary throughout Third Army. He would appear at the front without warning, demanding to know why units weren't advancing faster, threatening to relieve commanders who showed any hesitation, and personally leading traffic jams at river crossings, while cursing at soldiers to move faster. Patton carried pearl-handled revolvers and wore a helmet so shiny it could be spotted from miles away, making himself a target to inspire his troops with his fearlessness. Soldiers told stories about Patton standing in the open during artillery bombardments, refusing to take cover because he believed that if he showed fear, his men would too. Some officers thought this was reckless theater. But Third Army loved Patton and drove themselves beyond exhaustion to meet his demands. Patton's notorious relationship with Omar Bradley created constant tension in the command structure. Patton was older and more experienced than Bradley, had been Bradley's superior officer earlier in the war, and believed he should be commanding Bradley rather than serving under him. Patton made no secret of his contempt for Bradley's careful, methodical approach, calling Bradley timid and unimaginative in private conversations that sometimes reached Bradley's ears. Yet Patton also respected Bradley's authority and followed orders even when he disagreed. Though he would argue vociferously for permission to take risks, Bradley wouldn't approve. The liberation of France showcased Patton at his finest. With Third Army advancing so rapidly that German forces couldn't establish defensive lines, Patton would attack continuously day and night, never giving the enemy time to rest or reorganize. When German units tried to retreat, Patton's tanks would cut them off, forcing thousands of prisoners to surrender or die trying to escape. Third Army liberated more French territory in August 1944 than all other Allied armies combined, a feat that made Patton a hero to the French people and restored French faith in American military prowess. Patton's ruthless exploitation of success meant that German forces in France never had a chance to form a coherent defensive line until Third Army reached the borders of Germany itself. The supply crisis in September 1944 stopped Patton's advance and created one of the most bitter controversies of the war. With supply lines stretched across France, there wasn't enough fuel and ammunition to keep all Allied armies advancing simultaneously. British Field Marshal Montgomery proposed a concentrated thrust in the north toward Germany's industrial Ruhr region, which required giving Montgomery priority for supplies. Bradley wanted to advance on a broad front with American armies in the center and south, which would share limited supplies among multiple armies. Patton argued passionately for giving Third Army all available supplies and letting him drive straight into Germany, arguing he could end the war by Christmas if he received logistical priority. Patton's notorious statements about post-war policy caused major controversies during the occupation of Germany. Patton believed that Germany should be rebuilt quickly to serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, and he thought that former Nazi Party members who weren't war criminals should be allowed to hold administrative positions because they had the expertise needed to rebuild German infrastructure. These statements outraged the American public and politicians who demanded harsh punishment of anyone associated with the Nazi regime. Patton also made statements suggesting the United States should fight the Soviet Union immediately while American forces were already in Europe and before the Soviets could consolidate their control over Eastern Europe. These remarks were considered insubordination and possibly treasonous, leading Eisenhower to relieve Patton of command of Third Army in October 1945. Patton's death in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a minor car accident ended his career and sparked conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Some people believed Patton was assassinated because his statements about the Soviets and post-war policy made him politically dangerous. Most historians dismiss these theories as baseless, but they demonstrate how controversial Patton remained even after his death. Patton's legacy as America's greatest tactical commander of World War II is secure despite his personal flaws and political controversies. His aggressive leadership, personal courage, and operational brilliance produced results that speak louder than any criticism of his personality. And now the #1 spot takes Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander. Dwight Eisenhower commanded more military power than any person in human history up to that point, serving as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe and directing the invasion and liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany. What made Eisenhower's achievement remarkable wasn't just winning battles, but holding together a fractious coalition of armies from multiple nations with different strategic priorities, national rivalries, and competing commanders with massive egos. Eisenhower's diplomatic skills and political acumen were as important as his military judgment. Because keeping the Allies united and focused on defeating Germany required constant negotiation and compromise, Eisenhower's notorious ability to smooth over conflicts and find compromises that kept everyone working together became the key to Allied victory in Europe. Before World War II, Eisenhower had never commanded troops in combat and seemed destined for a career in staff positions and training. Commands. George Marshall recognized Eisenhower's talent for planning and organization, promoting him rapidly from lieutenant colonel in 1941 to five-star general by 1944, leaping over hundreds of more senior officers. Marshall sent Eisenhower to London to command American forces in Europe, then made him commander of the North African invasion, and finally selected him as Supreme Commander for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Each promotion thrust Eisenhower into larger responsibilities with higher stakes, and each time Eisenhower exceeded expectations through hard work, political skill, and sound military judgment. Eisenhower's command of the North African invasion taught him brutal lessons about coalition warfare and the difficulty of commanding Allied forces with different national priorities. British generals doubted American combat effectiveness after the humiliation at Kasserine Pass, where German forces destroyed an American armored division in Tunisia. Eisenhower had to rebuild American credibility while managing British condescension and coordinating operations with Free French forces who had their own political agendas. The North African campaign moved slowly and caused more casualties than expected, but Eisenhower learned invaluable lessons about amphibious operations, logistical challenges, and managing difficult subordinates. When German and Italian forces in North Africa finally surrendered in May 1943, Eisenhower had transformed from an inexperienced theater commander into a confident leader capable of orchestrating complex operations involving multiple nations. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 introduced Eisenhower to one of his most difficult subordinates, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery was brilliant, vain, cautious, and openly contemptuous of American military competence. He regularly ignored Eisenhower's orders, changed operational plans without permission, and publicly criticized American generals. Eisenhower's notorious patience with Montgomery became legendary as he tolerated behavior from the British general that would have ended any American officer's career. Eisenhower understood that Montgomery was politically untouchable because of his popularity in Britain, and he calculated that managing Montgomery's ego was preferable to creating a crisis in Allied unity. The planning for D-Day demonstrated Eisenhower's ability to synthesize advice from dozens of experts and commanders into a coherent operational plan. Every aspect of the invasion required careful coordination. Naval bombardment, aerial bombing, airborne drops, amphibious landings, logistical support, deception operations, and follow-up reinforcements all had to mesh perfectly, or the invasion would fail. Eisenhower assembled a staff of brilliant planners and gave them the authority to work out details while he focused on strategic decisions and coalition management. The most crucial decision Eisenhower made about D-Day was choosing June 6, 1944 as the invasion date after a storm-forced postponement of the original June 5th date. Weather forecasters predicted a brief break in the storm on June 6th, but conditions would still be marginal with rough seas, high winds, and low clouds. Some commanders urged Eisenhower to postpone again and wait for better weather. But Eisenhower knew that waiting could mean delaying for weeks and missing the ideal tide conditions. Eisenhower alone made the decision to proceed, accepting full responsibility for what could become a catastrophic failure. His famous message prepared in case of failure read, "The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." The Battle of the Bulge became Eisenhower's finest moment as supreme commander. When German forces attacked through the Ardennes, Eisenhower immediately grasped the strategic situation and began shifting reserves to contain the penetration. He called a meeting with his commanders at Verdun and told them to stop thinking defensively and start planning counterattacks, setting the tone for the Allied response. Eisenhower's controversial decision to give Montgomery temporary command of American forces north of the German Bulge prioritized military efficiency over American pride, showing his willingness to make unpopular decisions when necessary. Montgomery's insufferable behavior during and after the battle, where he implied that British forces had saved the Americans from disaster, infuriated American generals and nearly destroyed Allied unity. Eisenhower spent weeks smoothing over the controversy and preventing his command from fracturing over national rivalries. The drive into Germany in 1945 demonstrated Eisenhower's strategic judgment when he decided not to race for Berlin, but instead focus on destroying German armies and meeting Soviet forces at the Ilay River. Churchill and many American generals wanted to capture Berlin before the Soviets. But Eisenhower argued that Berlin was a political objective with no military value and wasn't worth the casualties it would cost. He also believed that agreements made at Yalta, allocating Berlin to the Soviet occupation zone, meant that American forces would have to withdraw from the city after capturing it, making the effort pointless. History has debated whether Eisenhower's decision was strategically sound or politically naive. But he made the choice based on his understanding of the alliance's political agreements and military priorities. Eisenhower's notorious conflicts with Churchill over strategy defined their relationship throughout the war. Churchill constantly advocated for Mediterranean operations and advances through Italy or the Balkans, trying to prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. Eisenhower insisted that the cross-channel invasion of France and the direct approach to Germany offered the quickest path to victory. These strategic disagreements reflected different national priorities, with Britain trying to preserve its empire-limit Soviet expansion. While America focused on defeating Germany as quickly as possible, Eisenhower managed to maintain his strategic vision while preserving the Anglo-American alliance through patient negotiation and compromise on secondary issues. The end of the war in Europe came on May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. Eisenhower had orchestrated the liberation of Western Europe, destroyed the German military, and held together a coalition that threatened to fracture dozens of times. His achievement in balancing military necessity with political reality made him the indispensable man of the European War. All right, these 5 generals represent the best America had to offer during World War II, each bringing unique talents that contributed to ultimate victory. Marshall built the machine that won the war, transforming America from a minor military power into an unstoppable force. MacArthur's island-hopping strategy revolutionized Pacific warfare and saved countless lives while defeating Japan. Bradley's steady leadership and concern for his soldiers made him the rock upon which the liberation of Western Europe was built. Patton's aggressive brilliance and lightning-fast advances showed the world what American armored forces could accomplish when led by a tactical genius. And Eisenhower held it all together, managing egos and coalitions while orchestrating the defeat of Nazi Germany. Each man had flaws and made mistakes, but their results speak louder than any criticism. Together, these 5 generals led America and its allies to victory in the greatest conflict in human history. Their legacies continue to influence military thinking and leadership principles today, reminding us that winning wars requires not just courage and firepower, but also strategic vision, organizational brilliance, diplomatic skill, aggressive execution, and steady competence. World War II demanded all these qualities, and America was fortunate to have generals who possessed them when the world needed them most. All right, let us know in the comments below. Do you agree? And what are your thoughts of this ranking?